Hello and welcome. Today is National Women's Day. It commemorates that iconic 1956 protests. That's when 20,000 women marched on the union buildings protesting against past laws. They were adding their voices in the fight against apartheid. Now, since democracy, South Africa has celebrated Women's Month every year, as you know, in August, the month of August, but not without criticism that government initiatives do nothing but pay lip service to the very real challenges that women in our country still face. 2020 was meant to be a pivotal year for the accelerated realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women, not only here in South Africa, but around the world. Now, it marks 2020, 25 years of what was considered the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights. I'm talking about the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. That was adopted unanimously by 189 countries. So this evening on Newzroom Afrika, we bring you The Reckoning Room, our Women's Day dialogue with change makers from diverse industries who will help us unpack the journey that we are still on in empowering women. Well, we're joined today by Shongwe from the UN Women South Africa Multi-Country Office, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who we know is the former Public Protector of South Africa and Professor of Law at Stellenbosch University, also joining us for this discussion today. Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. It's always great to talk to you. Dr. Kopano Mabaso is a novelist and a medical doctor in public health. Last but certainly not least, Divya Vasant is a development economist and she's also CEO of the Amazi Group. To all of our guests today, thank you so much for your time. So let's just take a step back for a moment and take you back to 1995. That was when 17,000 delegates, 30,000 activists from across the globe streamed to Beijing, and it was to attend the 4th World Women's Conference. Now, this was one of the largest meetings to promote women's rights ever, and it resulted in the adoption, the unanimous adoption, of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And Shongwe from the UN Women's South Africa Multi-Country Office helps us to set the scene.
Happy Women's Day. 2020 is a pivotal year for gender equality. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the blueprint to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment. 25 years ago, thousands of women from across the world got together and pulled together what has become the platform and blueprints that we have all been following across the world. This 2020 is also 20 years since the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the birth of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, where women finally can sit at the table and engage with peace and security agendas. This year is also UN Women's 10th birthday. 10 years ago, we pulled together from civil society, women across the world, advocated for the birth of this wonderful organization that I serve today. In addition, this year marks the end of the Africa Women's Decade, the target year for the African Union's initiative on silencing the guns, but it is also the beginning of the decade for women's financial and economic inclusion that we proudly sit at a time when His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa is the chairperson of the African Union. The UN is celebrating these milestones under the Generation Equality Campaign, the theme for Women's Month here in South Africa. Generation Equality was a groundbreaking multi-generational effort that we are using to engage and collaborate with women and organizations, member states, stakeholders all across the world who care about seeing the end of gender equality. There has been significant progress on women's rights since the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action. 131 countries across the world have removed discriminatory laws. More girls are in school than ever before. More than 60% of countries have reached gender parity in education enrollment in particular. Maternal mortality rates have dropped. The proportion of births attended by skilled attendants have dropped. Importantly, Africa has led the world in showing what it looks like to have parity in cabinets and parity in parliaments, with South Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, amongst those leading the 11 countries in the world who have reached parity in their cabinets. We are so proud of the recent appointment of Rose Oshuka Raponda as the new Prime Minister of Gabon. She comes from a background as an economist and having worked in defense as well. We are excited that the numbers are growing. We are not at 50% yet across the African continent, but we know that this is possible. CEOs of companies, you appoint 2 or 3 women to boards, and that's great, but what does it look like in your spend? When you buy and purchase from companies, from your suppliers, how many of your suppliers are women-owned businesses? We know from our global data that only 1% of procurement spend goes towards women. The shadow pandemic, what we've termed as UN Women, the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. Some are calling it the second pandemic, others are calling it the sustained pandemic of gender-based violence. Although we have seen increased activism here in South Africa with the total shutdown, the Me Too movement, and others across the world have reached a crescendo. 1 in 3 women around the world continue to be impacted by gender-based violence. And we congratulate South Africa for the launch of the National Strategic Plan to end violence against women and girls, and look forward to seeing real transformation using and leveraging the platform of the National Strategic Plan. And so the intersectional discrimination that COVID-19 has brought up, the intersection of gender with migrants and displaced persons and LGBTI plus persons, people in detention who are facing intersectional discriminations, require our urgent push and investment as we look to build this future world that we can experience all collectively equality in our generation. And so we want to call on men. The last unfinished business of gender equality in this continent and in the world is in your hands. Take responsibility. Make it your business. If everybody took responsibility to ensure gender equality wherever their circle of influence is, we truly will see a change and a new generation of equality. And we look forward to a real march ahead through this platform of generation equality.
And that was Anne Gituku Shongwe, just setting the scene for us for what will be a wide-ranging discussion on this Women's Day, our Women's Day dialogue in the Reckoning Room here on Newzroom Afrika. So I want to get straight into it with our guests who are on the line with us. 25 years now since what was that global policy document on gender equality. How do we unpack, and I'm going to perhaps start with Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, UCT's Vice Chancellor. Prof, let's start with you. How do we unpack this moment that we are in? Let's begin in South Africa. The many grave, life-threatening, earning challenges that women still face in our country as we read the situation now, of course, through the lens of COVID-19.
The progress, we have made some progress. It is not enough. And I say we made progress because back then, 25 years ago, the numbers of women just in parliament were not what they are now. The visibility of women leadership in higher education was not what it is now. It doesn't mean that now it's perfect. It just means now is better than it used to be 25 years ago. Now is also better in the sense that women, more and more women feel comfortable when it comes to gender-based violence to report. 25 years ago, women were not even reporting. They were made a joke of when they reported. And so they were not reporting, and there was this facade as if it doesn't exist. And the few who reported were either shamed. It wasn't what it is now. Now, we can mobilize against gender-based violence. The statistics, as shocking as they are now available because women can report. It's not even all of it. And we are at a point where we should be asking different questions as well. If a place says 0 when it comes to gender-based violence, we shouldn't just be happy and think that there's nothing there. We should ask them how they are collecting data. For us, for example, at UCT, when we track gender-based violence, we don't just look at gender-based violence that happens within our campus. We look at gender-based violence that affect our students, whether it's on main road or in town. As long as our student is affected, we count it in our statistics. And that, for different places track this data differently. And so it is important we are now 25 years down the line asking different questions. And in a way, the Beijing conference was important because it also brought some of the things to the fore. Having the numbers is important, but not sufficient. We've got to go beyond the numbers and look at what are these numbers. We have to start now refining which women are these. Are there class differences? Are there apartheid racial differences to an extent that Black African women are at the end or at the end of the colonial procession?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I agree with Prof. Phakeng that, there have been incredible advances and many women I myself, starting up my career looked up to. But unfortunately, these advances only, are amongst a small population of women. And I think what's important is that it's about all women and no woman is left behind. So, the ideals of UN Women around women being paid the same as men for the same work, that, unpaid care work.
I have to think about the economist and feminist Devaki Jain, who says, are we fighting for women to get a bigger share of a poisoned cake? And I think that's very important for us to think about because it highlights the need to really get into systemic activism.
Who is in front? Is it going to be the failure of the feminist movement that actually refused to recognize the differences within the women, that race matters within, class does matter as well? We've got to get there too. But also, the women who are there, what's their ideology? What's their stance? What do they represent? Are there women there who are just driving the agenda of patriarchy and a racist agenda? The agenda of racialized narratives that they got from the establishment so that they can be safe. We've got to ask those questions, but we can, because now we've got a few more women than we did 25 years ago. Of course, Michelle.
This is The Reckoning Room. This is our special Women's Day broadcast. Stay with us. You're watching The Reckoning Room right here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Thanks for staying with us on this Women's Day. Let's get going again with Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng. And Prof, I want to talk to you about this issue around the representation of women in senior management roles. Now, you and I have talked about the issues and the investigations into universities in particular when it comes to gender transformation. What has been your experience as a black woman Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town?
The experience in terms of being VC, first of all, is that we are very few women Vice-Chancellors in the country. It's UCT, NMU, University of Zululand, and University of Mpumalanga that have women Vice-Chancellors. And that, if there isn't any way in which you get trained to be Vice-Chancellor, except going through the ladder. Okay, so I started from being senior tutor. I went through every academic ladder up to full professor and then dean and then DVC. That's how you learn to do the job. But actually, you get mentors, you get help. So I've had a lot of women support and men of all races who supported me to get here. So for me, from the first day I got into office, who I am, it's almost like you have to defend your being as a woman. Pillar I had to deal with was my qualifications were questioned. There were people who were saying I must be investigated. Like my PhD. I mean, not as if I got it in Cambodia or anywhere in the country. I mean, I'm working class. I got everything here. My international experience was through my work, right? They could easily phone vets and say, is it for real? No, right? The second pillar is the dress. You remember the dress that I was wearing? The very long dress that covers everything, except that it shows that I don't have a cleavage. The country was obsessed with it. In fact, what's interesting is nobody said, wow, she's so small up there. People say, oh, how can she wear a dress like that being VC? Have you ever had a man being challenged for not wearing a tie? Have you ever? And of course the accusations go on. She's too loud. She brings whatever. I don't want to go into environments that are in the council's remit. But what I'm saying is that defend your being. I mean, at 53 years old, I've got to explain that actually I do have a sense of humor. That doesn't make me a joke. I'm a B1 rated scientist. And there aren't many women who are B1 rated scientists in this country, let alone black. I'm saying even white, who went to better schools. I don't have to do that. Why should women defend their being after delivering on every work? And so I'm saying there's something about a woman. You're not just a woman, you are many things. So you are black, you have a personality, you dress up in particular ways, you come from a particular socio-economic background. When those things come together, and you tick all the boxes when it comes to the work, and integrity, obeying the rule of law, and so on. It's the intangibles. And you know why? Because where there's a will to prosecute, there is always evidence. You can make it, manufacture it, create it, foreground it. And in this age of access to social media and so on, you can also propagate it.
Yeah. You know, I want to just speak to Dr. Mabaso and Divya Vasant as well, because what you're saying, Prof, talks to almost the kind of basic level that the discussion goes down to when a woman is in a powerful position. Like you say, you have to defend your qualifications, you have to explain that these qualifications are real, I got them legitimately. You try to make yourself smaller, take up less space, as you say, defend your being. Dr. Mabaso, I want to start with you and talk to us about your experience when it comes to the differences you found in your field when it comes to occupying your position as a woman.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, I think in some respects, civil society, tends to predominantly have women in it. And so there's different challenges. But I mean, I absolutely agree with Dr. Phakeng, that as women, we often do find ourselves having to dim our light and almost shrink back a little bit, not to offend or intimidate or to stir. And I think it's important, that women don't apologize for who they are. I mean, I think, the only way these things are going to change is if women are involved in decision making in all spheres of social and political life, that there isn't any corner, any discussion, any aspect of how life is conducted in South Africa that shouldn't have women included. And we see that, in crises, we see that mechanisms that should be in place to enable women and children to thrive are not in place because often, we're not included in those discussions. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have a long way to go. I think we've got some exciting and inspiring trailblazers like Professor Phakeng who are charting the way. And yeah, to make sure that we pick up the baton and continue with that.
Divya, do you want to weigh in on this issue about women occupying space and in many aspects, as we've been discussing, shrinking back, making yourself smaller, not being too loud, too aggressive?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, both Prof and Kopano really kind of pose very important questions. And I think just reflecting on my own lived experience, I think it's very difficult for men to understand just the daily adjustments that women make to exist in an environment that was never built for them. And I actually posed a challenge to many men within my own circle of influence to say, I challenge you just for a week to go and exist in an organization where every room you walk into only has women and you are the only man. And I want you to notice your body language, notice how you feel, notice the ways in which you start feeling uncomfortable and feeling like you have to adjust yourself to be in that space. If you can survive a week, firstly, I will be impressed. But secondly, that is a lifetime of women having to figure out those adjustments for the spaces that you so comfortably sit in. And that, Michelle, is the reason why at 28, I decided that I would create spaces for women only that I wanted to exist in. And I started walking the journey of creating a woman-owned, woman-founded, woman-run, woman-led, for women-only organization where every room I walk into and every space I walk into is filled with brown and black women. Because that is the space in which I don't need to justify myself. I don't need to explain myself. I don't need to adopt any other persona. When I am direct and when I hold people accountable, I'm not aggressive and I'm not a bully. I'm there to get the work done, and that's how I'm seen. And so, I think it's very important that even within just the circles of people that we exist in, our own networks, that we actually challenge men to kind of understand how it would feel to exist in woman-only spaces, and then start having the conversation from there, because that's a relatable place to start. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I also think it is important for more women to feel free to create spaces for themselves, because we all do our best work when we feel we can just exist authentically, and we don't have to put on a different persona or adjust ourselves because the environment isn't actually conducive to our belonging.
And you wouldn't understand what you're saying unless you are a woman, would you? It's so triggering for me what you're saying, the fact that you created spaces for women, by women, and the fact that that meant you didn't need to adjust yourself or explain yourself. And as you were saying that, it dawned on me yet again just how much we do that as women. Absolutely.
And those adjustments, remember, Michelle, those adjustments we've been doing since we were children, They're so deeply ingrained in us because as women, when we live in a patriarchal society, we're always the ones doing the adjustments and the shifting, right? In most of the spaces that we enter, whether it's actually even your familial space, whether it's your private space, you as the girl child are doing all the adjusting, and the boy child isn't having to do any. And then when you go out into the public spaces and you go into your schooling environments and beyond that into your work environments, again, as women, we're the ones constantly doing those adjustments, constantly having to wrestle with our identity. Do we feel comfortable? And that's been our existence.
So I don't subscribe to the idea that I only want a women's space. By the way, even though all of my deputy vice chancellors are women, it wasn't like we went around and said, men, no, we just want. We were looking for the best suitable people for the jobs, and they happen to be women.
I mean, I think my approach, Michelle, has always been, and I think the integrity is key, to work with excellence, to have integrity, to use the little privilege and space that we have and the platforms we have to make sure that nobody, at least in our arm's reach, is left behind. I think, the women that I have admired from afar, I don't necessarily know personally, but I've been admired by how they, do what they do with excellence. They do what they do with integrity. They don't apologize for who they are. I think we're privileged in the space that we work in as Grow Great to be working with incredible women in communities. We have a social franchise called Flourish, which is women from all sorts of backgrounds running antenatal and postnatal classes in their communities. And so this is, mothers, women-led organization, helping other women, earning an income, but making a difference to the lives of people in their community. So I think those are examples of how, we use our little corners where we are to make a difference, both for ourselves and for others. And we do that with integrity and with excellence. And I think that's always just been my approach to all of this.
Well, coming up next, we will take a deeper look at the impact of COVID-19 on the health of women and children. This is The Reckoning Room. This is our special Women's Day broadcast. Stay with us. Thanks so much for staying with us here on The Reckoning Room for this special Women's Day dialogue. Thanks so much for staying with us here on The Reckoning Room for this special Women's Day dialogue. Dr. Mabaso, I want to bring you into this discussion and talk about the issue of malnutrition, and as we relate that issue to the jobs crisis we are in and how much of that jobs crisis does impact women directly. We know that just some of the numbers coming to us, over 1 million domestic workers, and they are mainly women. They've been desperate for work for the past few months, unable to work for the past few months and put food on the table. Talk to us about the kind of impact that has on one's psyche.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think women have, pre-COVID, were most vulnerable in the labor market, but certainly COVID has made it worse. More women are unemployed now than they were before, well, in comparison to men, rather. And this, of course, has knock-on effects on society. So definitely, I mean, I think in terms of food security, there's no doubt that this has an impact. But I do think that, they say never waste a crisis. And there's an opportunity that this crisis presents to us to reimagine how we rebuild post-COVID, we have this rise of social distress, mental health issues, gender-based violence issues, education issues. We're really worried about what's going to happen to this education year. The ECD sector, as I said earlier, the first 5 years, Hickman's curve, a very well-known curve that shows that what a child learns in the first 5 years sets them on a trajectory for the rest of their life. And if children are not being able to access ECD during this time safely, or parents are not able to pay fees, then what does that mean for the future generations? We risk that this pandemic casts a shadow on generations to come. So how do we think creatively? And I think I shared a little bit about the Flourish Social franchise that I spoke about, but there's another great one called Smart Start, which creates an opportunity for women in communities to own their own micro enterprise. So it's a small social franchise where they are trained to give quality ECD services to their community. And so they have an opportunity to top up their income. But we're also ensuring that children are not just sitting in daycare centers and being fed and being kept safe, but are actually learning. So there's an opportunity here to say, how do we find dual purpose interventions that both support income generation, particularly for women, because we know that's where the most vulnerability lies, but that also simultaneously address social or developmental needs. And I think those are interventions that government can come behind. And there's incredible examples across civil society that have demonstrated that they have an impact, but could do with strategic government funding to take them to scale. But I also think we shouldn't be letting big business off the hook. Money is fungible, right? The money that you are using for food, and food is becoming incredibly expensive, is the money that you could buy data with, is the money that you could print a CV with, is the money that you can get on a taxi and go to an interview with. So I think there also needs to be increased social solidarity around who's responsible for responding to this crisis. And so, for example, food retailers and manufacturers, what about reducing or removing markups on a basket of nutritious foods for the next 6 months? Government has put a little bit more money in the hands of families, but that money is not going to go far if food prices continue to soar. We need to pull together as business, as civil society, as government to say, how do we collectively enable households to come through this crisis and to ensure that the cash that is in the hands of families is used to help them, survive this pandemic and to protect their livelihoods. So I think certainly in terms of government funding strategically post-COVID, but also big business, doing their part, putting their skin in the game, stepping up to the plate and making something as simple as food a little bit more affordable.
The future of women in South Africa will determine the future of our next generations.
I think there's a large body of evidence, both locally and internationally, that does demonstrate that we are poorer as a country for not ensuring that, all women have the opportunity to live full and productive lives, and that likewise, that children have an opportunity to live full and productive lives, and that those of us who are fortunate to have had people and opportunities and spaces that have enabled us to sit in leadership positions, to use those for the betterment of women, to make sure that where we are in our corner, we ensure that no woman is left behind, that we also redefine what it looks like to lead in the workplace. That, for example, breastfeeding in the workplace, allowing and enabling women to work flexible hours, providing the kind of support that is necessary for women to thrive. So not continuing what we've inherited from men, but really challenging those norms and creating spaces that enable us as women to thrive and to flourish, and to make the contribution that we know we are capable of making, and that is so essential for our society to really be where it wants to be.
Thank you. Divya, Vasant?
I think maybe to ask the question a slightly different way. I think that a successful future is a feminist future. And I think it is a different provocation to a woman-led future, because a feminist future is a future that looks at a framework that is driven by inclusivity. And I think, Mamzanele Mbeki taught us that Feminism is not the opposite of patriarchy. Matriarchy is the opposite of patriarchy. Feminism is a philosophy and a framework that's built on the principles of inclusivity. And specifically, it's a framework that installs humanity back in every value chain, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about business. It puts the human and the need to consider the human at the center of why we do what we do. And I think, particularly from my experience and just the fields that I'm in, I think feminist business models, inclusive business models, social entrepreneurship that has an inclusive agenda from the very get-go. The reason for being and for incorporating is to build inclusively, so that as you build commercial value, you're actually building social value as well. That is what a sustainable economy could look like if we change the frameworks that we use to create value. And I think Dr. Kopano raised it beautifully to say, now is the time for whatever sphere, whatever field that we sit in, now is the time to be deliberate about rewiring our spaces to think about inclusivity. Now is that time. And I think from my own perspective, I think now is the time that every business in South Africa should be a social business. There should not be a distinction and a differentiation between big business, commercial business, and then social enterprise. Every business should be a social enterprise, because that is how we all take up the call to action in the spaces that we exist in to build something that is more inclusive. And now's the time for us to be bold about it and to be brave about it and to encourage that.
This COVID pandemic has really, illuminated the gaps. I think the recently released NITS CRAM survey shows that more women have lost their jobs just during the lockdown than have men. And we know that this is going to be devastating for families, because children are more likely to live in a female-headed household than they are likely to live with both parents or even with just a man. So the impact of women losing their livelihoods is devastating. And so I think this is a time where we need to reimagine how we're going to rebuild post-COVID, and how it shouldn't be just picking up where we left off. We have an opportunity to reset some things that were not working. And how do we reimagine a labor force and a society that is inclusive of all women, that protects the livelihoods of women and of families?
I think when you bring that back home and you look at inclusivity and you look at the agenda for women, I think it's fantastic for us to put out the goals that we want 40,000 new young female entrepreneurs in our ecosystem. But what are we doing within our systems to incentivize women to take up that call to action? What are we doing to reform tax? Tax currently is prohibitive and almost traumatic for a female entrepreneur. It perpetuates that bigger business gets to prosper at the cost of younger entrepreneurs, particularly female entrepreneurs. And the same can be said about our banking systems and our governance systems. And unless we actually go into those systems and look at how to change the incentivization, unfortunately, no matter the number of goals we put out, we're going to perpetuate an oligopolistic economy.
It's like the discussion always goes, the policies for change are there. We're very good as a country when it comes to having the right things on paper. A different story when we look at implementation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even looking at the most recent conference for the status of women that happened at the UN, there's a lot of talk about needing to reform policy, needing to include more women, and to Prof's point, have more women in the numbers, but is that translating into a voice? And it's only when we take advocacy to the system and the guardians of that system, who again are men and have been men, and we force a reform, we're not going to see that voice come out. And that's particularly, I feel, when it comes to financial frameworks. where money is allocated and how it's allocated and who decides where it's allocated has to be by women to progress the agenda of women. And we don't have that representation.
Some of the big issues we're going to be unpacking on today's special broadcast of The Reckoning Room on this Women's Day. Stay with us. You're watching The Reckoning Room right here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Thanks for staying with us. And Prof, on a very, very practical You're watching The Reckoning Room right here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Thanks for staying with us. And Prof, on a very, very practical level, and I want to bring in Dr. Mabaso and Divya Vasant as well, you know, this issue around excellence being exclusionary. We've heard the explanations so many times before when it comes to white male-dominated boardrooms, because they say they've done the work, they've looked for black South Africans, they've looked for black women, but they don't find anyone who is qualified.
What do they mean by qualified? You know, what do they mean? Of course, if you get two people who, one meets the requirements, the other one exceeds them, because actually the ground has been laid for them for years. But this one, it's not that they don't meet the requirements. They meet the requirements. You might end up not choosing them because you don't recognize where they come from and actually what it took to, if you did that, you will see actually that this is a better candidate than this one for whom the ground was laid. What's at issue is people are not willing to explore this excellent candidate who's had to work more than 100 times to meet the requirements and is poised to be even bigger as long as you give them the support and the space to do that. So you get all these things that are said by women who qualify. You are never ready as a woman. Men are always ready. Okay? And sometimes even if they haven't amassed experience, they might just have the cultural capital and the social capital, which has got nothing to do with experience and ability to do the job. And so that sells more than what people have to deliver.
We were talking about, again, this issue around excellence being denied, but how it relates to healthcare for women and children and how these barriers for excellence continue to keep young women, black women and children out of the streams of excellence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, we have the hard job of undoing, 250 years of a perverse social engineering based on the color of people's skin, right? And so these things that, I guess downstream or on the face of it, it's pitting what Professor Phakeng is saying, a white candidate versus a black candidate. And I agree completely with her that we need to also look upstream. What are we not putting in place to change the trajectory of our country? I mean, even just before COVID, South African families, women in South Africa were living on the edge. A quarter of pregnant women in South Africa go hungry. 25% of households live below the food poverty line. A quarter of children are born with stunting. And I mean, there is unequivocal research that shows that chronic malnutrition disadvantages, makes it difficult, makes it near impossible for children to reach their full potential. I mean, a perfect example is, the child support grant during this time. It was a fantastic mechanism to address a malnutrition crisis, food insecurity during this time. But pregnant women are not included in that social security net. And in fact, DSTV was closed for a proportion of it. So there was about 300,000 births, I believe. So now you've got pregnant women who are not eating well, and that has intergenerational consequences. There are the Prof Phakeng that triumph over everything, but we can't, that's not enough anymore. It shouldn't be that a black child needs to be a miracle. It needs to have this incredible story of triumph after triumph after triumph. It's not fair.
I mean, if we think back to government's decision to allow the food programs at schools to continue even while schooling has been closed during the lockdown under COVID-19. I mean, that was a decision that should have been taken long before it was taken, but that's another issue when we look at what black children need to overcome to become a Professor Phakeng. It is, as you say, too much. And if we look at the headlines from July, COVID-19 corruption, we look at food parcels being stolen by our government officials. How does that kind of thing make you feel when you look at it through the lens of what black children in this country already have to overcome just to get out of the house and go to school in the morning? How much harder does that level of corruption hit you?
Yeah, no, it's devastating and it's embarrassing. And I think, as South Africans, I think we need to draw the line, in terms of what we're prepared to accept and what we're not prepared to accept. And that we stand up and we speak against corruption wherever we see it, whether it's in boardrooms or in civil society or in government.
Divya, Vasant, I want to bring you in on the topic of women-centered economic activism. When we take a look at our track record as a country, how do we score on women-centered policies around the economy?
My opinion, not well. And I think drawing on both what Kopano and Prof have been highlighting in their insights, numbers firstly don't necessarily translate to change. So, we can outwardly appear as if more women are coming into spaces, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the agenda for women is being materially progressed.
Prof, I want you to just, because we've come from such an important month in our country in terms of corruption, I think the month of July, for some reason, just coupled with the COVID numbers, coupled with the various other challenges we're facing as a country, just the amount of money that we are losing to looting and how much of a difference that money could have made to the lives of ordinary South Africans. Talk to us, Prof, about corruption and the lives of ordinary women and excellence.
It doesn't matter what your policies say. I'm talking about your conscience. Do you know what I'm saying? For me, you haven't broken any law, but there's something about your conscience that worries me. That says to me, I'm not sure. And I'm saying, I keep saying we have to start a conversation in our country of values.
This special Women's Day dialogue. Up next, former public protector, advocate Thuli Madonsela, who's also a professor of law at Stellenbosch University, speak to us about openness and transparency, keeping those who are entrusted with power in check.
Happy Women's Day to every woman. Women of South Africa have come a long way since the women of this country marched on the Union building, asking for basic things such as just freedom to participate in the economy and freedom to go wherever you wanted to go to locally. Law is a powerful instrument of social change, and it is one of the instruments that have been used globally to advance women's rights and gender equality. However, using law to oppress, suppress, and disadvantage. But at the start of this decade, we've been confronted with coronavirus, COVID-19, which has given us a lens through which to see our society and the world as a whole, and to confront realities that have been with us for some time. One of the things we've found is that law can be a powerful instrument of social change. Firstly, laws should be designed in such a way that they are impact conscious. And if we take the COVID-19 regulations, we didn't have to find out far too late that by closing down early child care centers, ECDC centers, women were going to bear the brunt. The issue of childcare is not the only issue where women have sort of been thrown under the bus during COVID-19. The economy is also another area where women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 regulations. Incidentally, actually, supermarkets and malls are more likely to spread COVID-19 than those open spaces where women sell their wares. And one of the most frustrating stories we all watched was a woman being arrested for selling acha. For me personally, it reminded me of my mom being arrested when I was 4 years old and I was left with a newborn child because she was selling sweets, fruits, before implementing these regulations and considering options that are less harsh. Even a harsh thing, even an issue such as alcohol, one would want to know who owns shebeens in the townships. A lot of them are owned by women. Let us just look at where do we go now. If we're saying that the next decade is going to be a social justice decade, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, what needs to change? Well, the first thing that I've indicated is the need to have laws that are impact conscious, and they can be impact conscious if we use data, if we collect data about the different situations that people live under, and think very clearly about how the laws are likely to impact on them. During our time, most of the laws have good content, but sometimes the implementation is twisted. And an example in this regard is the Equality Act. We are all battling with gender-based violence. We're battling with an economy that's not growing and that's not carrying everyone with it. We battle with the land question. We battle with education, with health, where health outcomes are not equal and women are primarily left behind. But one of the problems is that we just failed to implement the Equality Act. And in the end, we had somebody pull out of the back of their pockets, really, the Black Economic Empowerment Act. I'm not against Black economic empowerment. The issue, though, is it can't be at the expense of women empowerment. It also can't be an approach that is transactional, that is not systems driven. We need an approach similar to the one that was taken to solve the poor white problem after the 1932 Carnegie report, an approach that understands that society is a system, that gender-based violence is not happening simply because the justice system is not working. It's happening because of mental health challenges, unequal economic situations between women and men. It's also happening because the attitudes that were cultivated by apartheid and patriarchy have not been dealt with. And therefore, we do need to invest in changing mindsets. We do need to invest in dealing with mental health, which undermines our productivity and our efficiency as an economy. We all also know that corruption robs us of our resources. We are one of the countries that have been hard hit by the coronavirus, COVID-19. And having a lockdown was an ideal thing to do. But if you're going to lock down people, that means they are not going to be able to undertake economic activity. And most countries then released funds to make sure that people were placed as close as possible to where they would have been if there hadn't been coronavirus, COVID-19, and there hadn't been any lockdown. In our case, government could not release lots of funds. It did its best and released about 500 billion rand to make sure that at least some of the losses were offset. But now we hear that some of the money has not gone where it was supposed to go to. But the PPEs that were supposed to be procured and gone to hospital were not procured from service providers that are known, that provide these services at known prices. And seemingly some of this money has gone to people who are related to people in government. And things like that can be ended through transparency and accountability. And going forward, I have put a proposal to Minister of Finance, Minister Tito Mboweni. The proposal is simple: ensure that there's transparency. Let's put on the website and possibly on a screen at every office and at every municipality that is outside there that tells you what contracts have been issued for COVID-19 to whom and how much. And also that information should include what was the unit cost of whatever was procured, because then we can check the market value and what government paid for. Ideally, when you buy in bulk, you should pay less. I do not understand why would government buy from multiple service providers instead of single service providers, and preferably from the manufacturers. So that's the first suggestion, is transparency. The second suggestion is make sure that where corruption raise its ugly head, we nip it in the bud. We hold people accountable, we have them jailed, and we get back the money as fast as possible. We don't want what happened with state capture. We're 4 years down the line, you're still trying to track people, because by then their money is nicely siphoned into places overseas or tax havens overseas, and you're going to struggle to try and get it back. Happy Women's Day. We have 10 years, though, as women and as society, to end poverty and inequality and create a more socially just world. Because unless we do that, our economy is not going to grow sustainably, but worse, peace will always be an illusion if some of us are experiencing injustice.
A big thank you to everyone who took part in our discussion today, all of our panelists, including Anne Gituka Shongwe from the UN Women's South Africa Multi-Country Office, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, former public protector and professor of law at Stellenbosch University, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, who is Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, Dr. Kopano Mabaso, medical doctor in public health, she's also a novelist, and Divya Vasant, a development economist and CEO of the Amazi Group. Thank you to all of our panelists for an incredible discussion. Also, a big thank you to Uber Eats for keeping us all energized with beverages throughout this dialogue.